I'm very happy to be opening the stage here at Modular Summit Day 3, last day of the summit. I am Mass, known as Raining Coffee on Twitter. I do research at Maven 11. And the goal of this talk essentially is to tell developers why they should build modular and why some are doing that already. And the goal essentially is to prove the memes wrong. And there is a lot of memes about modularity being completely pointless. I'll have to say why it's not, and that's essentially what we're going to do today. So the methodology behind this is essentially the modular solids that we do have. So usually we know about the rollups, optimistic, CK, we have based rollups that are sequenced on the L1, we have sovereign rollups that settle to themselves, and we have what we call alt-DA rollups. So a rollup using Celestia, maybe settling to a separate settlement layer like an Ethereum. And there's some nuances here that we maybe don't care as much about, but validiums, app-specific, generalizable, and so on and so forth. And monolithic setups are great for some things and terrible for others. So some of the shortcomings are specifically fee markets. You generally share fee markets with all the applications on the blockchain that you're on. There's some nuances here, such as Solana, which has local fee markets, which helps with the noisy neighbor problems. There's also state bloat, so you have the state of every single smart contract. That could be hundreds of thousands of applications, and this all bloats the chain as well. And there's a humongous lack of control. This is probably the biggest issue. So you cannot do any upgrades for your specific application that you might need to make on a chain. There's no customization. You don't have any ordering, opcodes, gas limits, and so on and so forth. But you have some pretty powerful powers that you don't even have in sort of traditional Web 2. So synchronicity, you can call any application and make calls to it, swaps, whatever you need. This is super, super powerful. And you do lose that in a modular setup to some extent. And generally, you have a pretty decentralized validation setup. So Ethereum has a ton of validators. The same goes for a lot of other larger sort of monolithic setups as well. And you have users, generally, which some modular setups are still missing at this point. Modular setups and their properties are sort of the opposite. So you have some shortcomings. You generally have to derive some security. And there's some nuances there we'll get into later as well. You also lose generally interoperability. So most monolithic setup, as I said, have synchronized composability. They can call smart contracts and so on and so forth. You don't really have that as much with modular setups unless you have a very homogeneous setup with IPC, for example. And you have the asynchronous calls that you also lose. And this is where we have synchronicity on the monolithic setups. The powers you get, though, are pretty cool. So you get sovereignty. I think Nick White will speak about this later today as well. And you get upgradability. So if I need to make any upgrades about the things we talked about earlier, you can do that. And then I generally also believe that apps have to and are opinionated. So generally, you have some opinion about what kind of things your app should have, what they should be able to say, and so on and so forth. And you also gain ordering and customization. And we'll get into why this is powerful, especially for MEV. And you're also elastically scalable. So an Ethereum is generally only the same amount of power throughout. With a modular setup, you can sort of change things out as you need, which is super, super powerful. Now, one large issue that Solana solves with the local fee markets is this noisy neighbor problem. So this doesn't just extend to gas fees, but also to things like state bloat. And doing inventory risk management becomes extremely difficult because you're essentially sharing a warehouse with a ton of different applications instead of having your own specific warehouse where you set the pricing. And this goes for things like a swap, a transfer, and many other things as well, where you essentially are dependent on what other applications are using at the same time to how much you have to pay in gas. Now, rollups are growing. I think that is extremely clear. We have a ton of generalizable rollups coming out. Currently, we have 58 that are live. We have layer 3s, layer 4s, layer 5, layer 6, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a ton of upcoming products. I think which generally is somewhere around 200 that are coming out. Many of these are generalizable, but application-specific rollups are also coming out, which is quite exciting. And there's a variety of methods that are using to derive security. Some of these are more scalable than others. We'll get into why specific shared consensus is not quite ideal. And I think what we've seen is that this sort of move from generalizable to app-specific rollups is happening. And this is sort of a result of this stack and commodification of this maturing, which makes it a lot easier to launch a rollup. You can do that in a few minutes on things like Gelato, Conduit, Caldera, and so on and so forth. And generally, if you look here on sort of how much people are posting to things like Celestia, Ethereum in terms of call data or blobs, we generally see that the biggest ones being both generalizable, but we have some interesting ones here that are actually app-specific, for things like proof of play and SCI as well, and also orderly, which is on Celestia. Now, what has been very clear over the last year is that DeFi is going multi-chain. So developers are more often than not actually launching their applications on multiple rollups rather than a singular one. Now, there are still issues with this. We need things like chain abstraction, but there's a ton of different applications working on this specifically. We also come into an issue where, specifically in modular setups, we might need things like super builders, and obviously we lose this synchronicity that is super powerful. We also have a ton of inventory risks that are specifically caused by intent-based bridges. So we need solvers to take the risk because of challenge periods, which causes an optimistic setup 7 days before you can get your funds out. As such, we have people take inventory risk, and they'll take a fee because of that. We also have pretty crazy state fragmentation, but things like storage proofs, VM extensions, so things like Risk0's Bonsai, but also plenty of these storage proof providers are doing a good job here as well. But one issue is that these rules for state are still different from rollup to rollup. But I think there's some pretty cool things coming here in the future as well. We'll skip over these slides. But what we're starting to see is that fast monolithic blockchains are starting to realize that, we actually need modularity. We can't just stay monolithic. A recent example of this is SIDA on Solana. They have specific needs that can only be serviced in a setup where they're modular because they need some sort of customization. This is especially important for DEXs and AMMs. But what we also saw recently was the announcement of CK compression on Solana, which essentially is this sort of based Validium setup where, because of the incredible amount of state that Solana is producing, we need sort of ways to put some of this state off of the main chain, but we still won't be able to update this state. So what is very clear is that Solana, Monad, and many others are probably going to come down to a point where they're saying, we actually need setups. We need setups that can provide us these powers. And I think we're going to see in the next year or so a ton of rollups actually coming to Solana, which is sort of breaking the idea that monolithic setups are going to be a constant thing. They will obviously be powerful for some applications, and it's more of like a funnel. You'll probably start as a smart contract there. Now, the real powers that you get from building a modular setup, as we talked about earlier, was the customization. So here are things like precompiles, block times, gas limits, also the ability to change VMs. We're seeing SVM rollups, move rollups, WASM rollups. We're seeing blended rollups using all the above. And if you need specific things like CK, you can also do this. So an Ethereum only has a BNS 128, which is not the most secure sort of way to verify CK. You might want to change these things. You're also able to specialize specifically for your purpose. So this could be you want to be able to scale elastically with the amount of users that you get without needing to sort of make crazy upgrades or cause problems for other people on the chain as well. You also be able to do things like in-protocol data sources. So this could be things like Slinky from Skip, which is super powerful Oracle. This can cause things like Oracle extractable value. You might also want to do things on a database level. So a lot of people think of execution, consensus, and those things as the bottleneck, but things like reads and writes to the database is also super important to optimize. People like Sovereign Labs are working on this, obviously Monad, but also MegaETH. And maybe you want to do things like monitoring and response. Maybe you are a real-world asset rollup, and you want to be able to choose who can actually access your rollup. If there's an exploit happening, you might want to censor this. We can call this good censorship. Now, one of the most powerful reasons for people wanting to build modular is because we want to internalize our MEV revenue. So a Uniswap, for example, creates a ton of MEV. We might want to actually be able to control this, or maybe provide fair ordering. So generally, MEV, for example, is extracted by a leader, and where the leader proposes a block, you can extract value because you decide what gets put into the block or not. And this makes monetization extremely easy as an application. Or you can also do things like set ordering rules. So you could do verifiable sequencing rules, frequent batch auctions, intent-centric applications. And I said earlier, you can do things like good censorship, if you believe that's a thing. Now, as mentioned, MEV is extremely powerful. So as a modular application, you tend to get to the point where the monetization you're having here is priority fees. That we generally call MEV. You might also have some base fee that you're able to collect as well. That's probably higher than the amount of cost you're paying in call data and to make state updates. And the cost of a modular setup is generally just DA, maybe storage, and maybe compute. And there's some nuances here if you're like a shared security setup. Now, one of the most powerful things, I think, is that, as sort of Ken alluded to yesterday in some of the panels that he had, is that Uniswap has quite a few problems with sort of creating value for the LPs. There are things like LVR, and there's a ton of MEV that is sort of created on Ethereum, but it's all going to Ethereum validators rather than Uniswap token holders or Uniswap LPs. So they create a large amount of inefficiencies. Searchers are paying a lot of money to extract these profits, and these are being paid to the proposer rather than actually to Uniswap itself. So if they can control inclusion, they can extract priority fees. And this is essentially something I think, especially things like Uniswap, Maker, Aave would benefit from extremely. Now, there are some issues here. They probably want synchronous composability, especially in a based rollup type setup, where they can get this and keep this while still having auctions to extract MEV. We'll get into this a little bit later as well. But I think Uniswap is a perfect example of somebody who would have an incredible advantage of being actually in a modular setup. Now, as we talked about earlier, one of the things that you do need to do when you're a modular is you need to derive some degree of security. Generally, there's 3 ways to do this. There is data availability, so things like Celestia, Avail, EigenDA, and this is generally the last bastion of truth. And then you have settlement, which is generally censorship resistance of dispute resolution, so things like challenges for optimistic rollups, CK verification, and what have you. And then you have consensus, which is sort of this shared security model you have for interchain security, but you also get this with things like EigenLayer. Generally, the cost of consensus sharing is extremely high. So generally, if you have other validators, they're going to be opinionated, and if you're opinionated, you're going to want to be paid a specific amount of money because you're taking on some risk. So you have a cost of flashing, and generally, opinionated security is generally not the way to go. The costs are high, you have to incentivize, and maybe give away fees, but if you're big enough to create fees, why are you giving away the fees? That's generally the way I look at it. And generally, all the way down, I think DA is the only thing that is scalable in terms of derivable, because of the fact that with DA, the DA validators are not opinionated. They'll take your data, they'll order it, they'll put it in a block, they'll sample it, but they do not care about what kind of data they actually have. And it's an extremely powerful way to actually derive security. Now, one thing that we've also been seeing with this commodification of the modular stack is the fact that, and we can see this in TradFi and Web2 as well, is that when the demand for a product increases, it's generally because the prices of it decrease as well, the complements that they're reliant on. And when that happens, we see a great amount of innovation. And we're starting to see this specifically on these app-specific rollups, which is super, super powerful. And generally, we hope to get to a point where we have this commodity price, where you have the indistinguishable goods. And generally, this is probably going to be way further out. Crypto is generally more BD attention-driven at this point. But I do hope, and I think other people hope as well, is that as the industry matures, this becomes more of actually the thing that's going to happen. But what we are seeing is this API economy that we know from Web 2 coming into Web 3 as well. So you can plug easily into data availability layers. You can use rollup SDKs. If you want shared sequencing for some interoperability or easier ways to launch your rollup, you can do that as well. Maybe you want some MEV alignment. You can do auctions. Maybe you want some intents, whatever have you. Or maybe you want this economic security, although we just covered why this might not be the best idea. And then generally, you can have a ton of different type of CKVMs that are generally open source that you can use as well. Now, as mentioned, the apps are not quite here yet, but it does seem to me that they're actually on their way. We're having this mass commodification. We're seeing things like light nodes and wallets, which means we can use them on light nodes that are sampling blocks, and as such, we can increase the size of them. We're getting things like CK accounts on Celestia, which will enable some really, really cool use cases as well. Chain abstraction is coming to the modular setups as well, which will make utilizing different types of setups throughout these modular rollups a lot easier too. And we're seeing an incredible amount of outsourcing. So no longer do you need an application. If you want a rollup to do all this work yourself, you can simply outsource these to other people as well. And what we're seeing is sort of this rise of these global state layers and things like storage providers that are creating this state and liquidity uniformity, also driven by intents as well. And if we look at Selenium, which is a great block as well, where you can see data posted to Celestia, you can see that the amount of apps here are actually growing. So you have things like Orderly, Avo, and so on and so forth. And I expect this to grow a hell of a lot more over the next couple of months as well. Now, as mentioned earlier, we probably need some kind of base setup specifically for applications like a Uniswap. And the reason for this is that specifically Uniswap needs to be able to make synchronous calls to L1s, and other applications need to be able to make synchronous calls to them as well. And this is because a ton of applications depend specifically on Uniswap for the application. This could be intent-centric ones. There's also just a lot of people just calling Uniswap smart contracts. The same goes for a Maker or an Aave as well. And there's generally a spectrum with these base rollups. So generally, either we need based execution. This is a lot more difficult because it's very hard to scale this up on a decentralized blockchain like Ethereum, for example. So generally, the way this is going to happen is probably going to be some sort of based inclusion, where you have inclusion guarantees from the validator set of Ethereum, and you might get these super builders that are building or buying flow for these rollups. And this would be extremely, extremely powerful. And what happens when you are included in the same block as all the other transactions that are happening on Ethereum is that you can start to have these synchronous calls. You can actually start to have these auctions to extract MEV. And this means that these super powerful, super cool applications can now start to internalize this MEV revenue that they're creating instead of giving this away. But it also does mean that we're going to have these super builders. And these super builders are already extremely powerful. We have 3 major ones on Ethereum that are generally building most of the blocks that we're getting. This could probably get even worse in sort of a base rollup world where we might have maybe a Beaverville building for 15 rollups, maybe an Arsync building for 14, but because these 15 rollups are creating more MEV, they'll not be able to win every single Ethereum block building bid, which is pretty problematic. And generally also now, the Ethereum block times are quite slow, so 12 seconds. This is pretty bad UX if you're depending on this, so we might need things like pre-confirmations as well, so you won't have to wait for 12 seconds before your transactions get pushed through, which makes it pretty unusable for most applications. Now, as many have been saying over the last couple of months, is that it seems like most people are essentially building the same thing. We're seeing these auctions for flow and writer sequencing. We're seeing base rollups come out. And we're seeing this hyper-specialization specifically on these modular setups, specifically on application-specific ones. And what this is causing is that we're seeing also this on shared sequencing. We're seeing this on things like Suave. And in a sense, the cause of this is that many of the things that we realize we have to build, everybody else is realizing the same thing. So it seems like we're all in a world where the things that we are calling different things are actually the same thing after all. But it's probably going to be extremely exciting when we get these base rollups. And it's usually going to be happening out of protocol first, especially in these extremely large decentralized setups where we talked earlier about the fact that it's very difficult to make upgrades, and you need a lot of people to agree on these things. So generally, things like base rollups are probably going to be happening together with pre-confirmations out of protocol. We might get this coming to in protocol, but it might take a couple of years for this to actually happen. But it's probably a world that's going to be quite cool for you like Uniswap. We heard Ken yesterday. One thing I do want to touch on before we end here is the fact that it seems that we need to take this idea of global state further if we want to keep this synchronicity. And sort of go for this idea of a protocol to a state. Because if these global offset laws are completely different from rollup to rollup, we might want to set up where we have state that is sort of uniform in the laws that they have. So think like a Solana account model, and having these state laws being the same from rollup to rollup, maybe on like a uniform layer, maybe with super builders in this case. And this would make interoperability extremely, extremely easy. And that's all for me today. Thank you so much for having me.